Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 229 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danielle Cebulski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. They're the things that go bump in the night, the creatures that storm your mead hall and eat your friends, the beings that wander restlessly from their graves. I'm speaking, of course, about monsters. Monster stories have been with us since our very beginnings, and there are some truly wonderful ones that come to us from the Middle Ages, including early versions of some of my favorites, zombies and werewolves. This week, I spoke with Dr. Charity Urbanski about monsters in the medieval world. Charity is a teaching professor at the University of Washington, where she works on historiography, gender, power, and monstrosity. She's the author of Writing History for the King, Henry II, and the Politics of Vernacular Historiography. But lately, she's joined the dark side and switched her focus. Her new book is Medieval Monstrosity, Imagining the Monstrous in Medieval Europe. Our conversation on what medieval people found monstrous, some fan favorites, how to defeat a monster, and which classic monster is found much less often in medieval sources than you might think, is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Charity, for joining me to talk about monsters. I mean, who doesn't love to talk about monsters? Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
So in your book, you talk a little bit about monster theory. So for people who are not in post-secondary or never went to a post-secondary institution, what is monster theory?
Monster theory is really sort of a set of tools for people studying monsters to sort of interpret them, to see them as sort of cultural creations that are doing really important and meaningful work. So, yeah, I would describe monster theory mainly as a set of tools. Yeah.
Right. So you're looking at actual monsters for the most part, right? This was not an area of study that people thought was legit for a long time. Can you tell us how it sort of gained its legitimacy?
Right. Monsters are pretty much found everywhere in the medieval world, right? They're in the physical remains, they're in the literary remains. They really sort of stock the pages of our sources. So they're absolutely all over the place in the medieval sources. But for a long time, people were very reticent to engage with them and sort of embarrassed about them being there. Famously, J.R.R. Tolkien delivered a paper called The Monsters and the Critics, in which he took to task his fellow scholars for pointedly ignoring all of the monsters in Beowulf. And if you've ever read Beowulf, it's all about the monsters. Like, it just blows my mind that somebody could, scholars could be discussing Beowulf and ignoring Grendel's mother, the dragon. Tolkien basically argued that the monsters were absolutely central to the story, which they are. They are the foils for Beowulf's heroism, right? Without the monsters, there's really no Beowulf.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, what's really interesting about Beowulf is that it's the monsters that seem to have preserved the manuscript itself. There's one extant manuscript of Beowulf, and if we look at the other texts that are bound with it, they're all about monsters. So the monastic scribe, whoever copied this and bound it, what he was really interested in was the monsters.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the monsters are the reason Beowulf survived. And so, but it actually took a while. So Tolkien kind of got the ball rolling, but it's really not until like the 1980s, that we see scholars really engaging with the monsters that are found in these medieval sources. And it really sort of starts in English and art history, and historians are a little bit late to the party.
Yeah, I think it's probably because people are not really sure what space these monsters live in. And that is one of the beautiful things about monsters is they live in a space that is kind of in between. So I think it's probably because people weren't sure, are medieval people treating these monsters as a real thing or as a fictional thing? And what's your take on it? How did medieval people view monsters?
Oh, I think for medieval people, monsters were very real, right? I would say that the sort of definitive archetypal medieval monster is, the devil or demons. And those were really believed to not only have a real existence, but to be physically at work in the world, tempting humanity. So, yeah, I would say that for the most part, these monsters are really thought to have a real existence. Even if we look at some of the more, the devil and demons certainly were taken for granted, I would say, by pretty much all Christians in Western Europe in the Middle
Mhm.
Ages. But even if we look at more fantastical monsters, like the monstrous races that were thought to inhabit the edges of the world, yes, medieval people had not had contact with them, but because they were found in sources that were regarded as authoritative, written by ancient Greeks or Romans, these sources, these authors carried such weight that what's really interesting to me is that, we even find in the early modern period, well, in the late medieval and the early modern period, when people do go farther afield, going into the Far East, going down into Africa, they really expect to encounter some of these races, these monsters that have been described, and are sort of disappointed when they don't, and confused, very confused.
It's true. And one of the things that you're bringing up is the travel literature that you do find in the Beowulf manuscript, things like the Wonders of the East or the letter to Alexander from Aristotle. And those ones sometimes describe things that you can recognize as maybe this is a hippopotamus, but something's definitely not. So let's dig into those sources to begin with. So when we're talking about monstrous races or the monsters that you find at the edge of the world, what kind of stuff are you finding in these really important sources that, as you say, look like they're coming from Aristotle when absolutely they're not?
Right. Well, I'm really fascinated by the monstrous races, and they are human. And what I'm really interested in is the debate over their humanity, right?
Mhm.
So they are unusual humans, humans with unusual physical features, unusual customs, unusual habitations, unusual behaviors. So they might be, humans that differ slightly from the norm, like the skyopods, for example, the humans that are believed to have like one large foot they hop around on, and then they,
Mhm.
because they live in a very hot climate in Africa, they lay on their back and use their huge foot as an umbrella to shade themselves from the sun. Or the Blimii, who don't have heads but their faces are in their chest. And even the Cynocephali, the dog-headed people, these creatures, for the most part, or at least the ones that I am most interested in, tend to be unusual humans, humans that somehow differ from the norm, that have unusual characteristics.
And why do you think they appear in this travel literature when we know that people probably actually didn't spot anything that looked like that? Why do you think it's included in this travel literature?
That is a really good question. For some of these, we know, for the Ethiopians and the Pygmies, for example, we know that they actually exist. They're based on real peoples who actually exist, but they're included in these monstrous races as well. So some of these people actually existed and would have been encountered by Western Europeans even in antiquity. Where the imaginative work of sort of creating these other people that also differ from, Western European norms, but that differ in such radical ways, where that comes from, do you have any thoughts on it?
No, no. I mean, there are some of them, some of the animals that you find in the Wonders of the East really stick with me, like the snakes or the ants that are guarding the pepper. I think you have to burn the place down to get rid of the snakes or the ants. I can't remember which one I'm referring to now. And that's why pepper is black. But I've never asked myself that question either. Why would you include races that don't exist, or maybe you just heard from somebody else and you needed to put it in there? I don't know. Maybe I've heard other people say that these were all kind of a gesture to the wonder of God's creation, that he could basically create anything, and that these are examples of that, even if they seem monstrous to us. But no, I've never asked
Oh,
myself that question either.
well, I mean, that's definitely how they're interpreted in the Middle
Mm.
Ages, is that they are examples of God's omnipotence and his creativity. I mean, you can definitely see the origins of some of those fantastic animals like the griffins. And I mean, a lot of them are just hybrids where it's like, we'll just take a couple of parts and stick them together from different creatures. Some of them are also stories about the origins, really, of like why pepper is black.
Hmm.
So they're sort of stories that are used to explain some sort of phenomenon. A lot of this goes back to ancient Greek authors that come up with a lot of these monstrous races.
Yeah, yeah.
And I have to admit, as a medievalist, I'm not as familiar with, I know how they're imported into the Middle Ages and what they come to mean in the Middle Ages, but as for why these Greek authors would have created them in the first place, the Greeks and the Romans created all sorts of monsters, right? And monsters in general are just a good way of thinking about what it means to be human, which is something that the Greeks spent a lot of time doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
They created monsters for the gods to fight, monsters for humans to fight. Perhaps these monstrous races were just another way in which they pondered what it meant to be human. That's certainly how they end up functioning in the Middle Ages.
Well, I think that is a great explanation. So we definitely got there in the end. Having these monsters for gods to fight may well be the source of these monsters that become something that is thought to be factual, which makes for
Mhm.
all sorts of interesting stories. So while we're on the topic of humans,
Mhm.
let's look at the difficult part of this book because you have mentioned that there are some people that are not Christians and they are looked at as monstrous. And this sometimes means like the definition of monstrous that we think of now, but it sometimes just means different as in other. Can you tell us
Mhm.
why you included non-Christians in a book that's about monsters?
Yes. So, one of the things that has fascinated me about monsters, really, since I got into the literature on them, is the fact that so many different people are either overtly characterized as monstrous in the Middle Ages or can easily be seen if you look at it with the right framing. It's sort of, oh, these people are being described as monstrous. So, for me, I have to admit that my interest in monsters really developed out of my interest in social outgroups
Mm.
and the demonization and persecution of certain peoples. And so, monster theory allows us another way to look at how outgroups are created and how and why mechanisms of persecution are put in place. So, I understand that there will be people who may take issue with the fact that I've included non-Christians or even women in a book on monsters. But what I'm really interested in examining is how these groups were conceptualized, especially by the dominant Christian society in Western Europe at the time. And I think for non-Christians, for Jews and Muslims in particular, the way in which they are portrayed is often explicitly monstrous. And this is very, very clear if you look at medieval art. Deborah Strickland's book on Saracens, Monsters, and Jews, or Saracens, Demons, and Jews, excuse me, that was a revelation in many ways. So not only are they depicted as monstrous in, sculpture and illuminations, in all sorts of medieval sort of visual media. But if we look at textual sources, they are also being depicted as monstrous. And I realize that I'm using a rather capacious definition of monstrosity. Monstrosity can mean physical deviation from the norm, which is characterized by things like excess, deficiency, hybridity, things like that. Or it can be defined as behavioral characteristics, right? Monsters do monstrous things. And I think this goes back to really sort of Greek and Roman ideas about monsters and how they used monsters to define what it meant to be human and what it meant to be civilized. And so part of monstrosity, at least in these ancient sources, it's not just physical characteristics, it's always a matter of customs and behaviors as well. So, with that definition in mind, you can really see how Western Europeans in the Middle Ages are constructing various types of groups, especially non-Christians and non-Europeans, and even women, as monstrous, either in their physical characteristics or in their behavior. And so that's what I was really interested in exploring there, because I'm obviously fascinated by the more fantastical monsters, the dragons, the revenants, the werewolves. But for me, what's really important and what's really still affecting our world today is the way in which certain categories of people have historically been constructed as monstrous, have been demonized, have been singled out for persecution.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely important. And it's still being used when you see people that say the default is almost the same as the medieval default, where you have a European Christian male. And then if somebody is different from that, then that becomes monstrous. And what I'm thinking of perhaps is when people will cite biology or they will create a biological difference between people And when I'm thinking of this as being deployed in the medieval world, it's things like saying Jewish men menstruated. But,
Yes.
you see the same sort of arguments being deployed on the internet against different races, depending on the agenda of the person. So it's still being used. And that's why I think it's so important that you are looking back to the roots of this, at least the medieval roots of this, because that's your specialty.
Right, right. And honestly, that's sort of what got me into medieval history in the first place was the desire to explain certain attitudes and prejudices that I saw in the world around me and wanting to know where those came from.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, this really sort of goes back to this book goes back to the reasons I became a historian in the first place. As I said, the sort of monster theory sort of gave me the tools to think about this in a slightly different way. I will admit to the fact that I have always felt like I was pulling a bit of a bait and switch. This book grew out of a seminar that I started teaching at the University of Washington in 2011. So the seminars are sort of research oriented, and I organized mine around themes. And I thought, there are just monsters everywhere in the medieval sources. I'd really like to do one on monsters. And then I thought, if I'm teaching a seminar on monsters, we're definitely going to have to look at like non-Christians, non-Europeans, and women as
Mm-hmm.
well. And so I always felt a bit like I was luring students in with promises of dragons and then hitting them with anti-Semitism and misogyny.
I think that is the best kind of teaching where you slide it in through the back door and make sure that people who are looking at something realize that they're looking at something that has all sorts of reflections and all sorts of things that have built up to it in the first place. A monster is never just a monster. This is one of the things that you argue in the book.
Right. Yeah. So the title can be a little bit misleading, but I hope that I do a good job of explaining in the book why I have used the category of monstrosity in this sort of broader way in order to gain access and to examine some other types of monstrosity, not just the dragons and the werewolves.
It does make a lot of sense the way you've laid it out. But of course, that said, we got into the social stuff first. So let's get into the monsters. You have a
Right.
category that is called revenants. What does this mean? We don't call them revenants now. What does revenants include?
Okay, so revenants, I spend a lot of time with revenants. I'm very fond of them. Revenants are basically humans who have come back from the dead physically, right? They're not quite modern zombies. Modern zombies are probably the closest analog we have, but they have very different motivations from modern zombies. And one of the things that I find fascinating is if you look at sort of the evolution of a monster over time, just how much its meaning and its behaviors shift to reflect social anxieties and fears. I always go back to your standard sort of early to mid 20th century movie zombies, where it's always a result of some sort of voodoo curse. Those zombies sort of betray a fascination with sort of exoticism, with the loss of personal agency and autonomy. So there's a particular set of fears and anxieties that are being embodied in those. And if we look at sort of more recent zombies, zombies have become faster. They've become, they've kind of improved. Movie zombies have improved over the decades, and now they almost invariably reflect our fears about changes in science and technology, the result of some sort of infectious disease, quite often, some sort of contagion that is taking over and that is like threatening to overwhelm us, threatening to overwhelm humanity. So the closest analog is definitely modern zombies, but medieval revenants, and this is why I specifically stick with the term revenants, are different in some pretty important ways. For one, they're not interested in brains. They're generally not eating people. However, they are destructive quite frequently. They can bring disease and death with them. They can physically attack people, but they don't always do it. Sometimes they come back and they're asking for help. And I've sort of grouped the revenants in the book to two different categories. We have like a group of 12th century English revenants who sort of betray one set of anxieties and fears. And then we have a set of revenants from Icelandic sagas that are dealing with a very distinct, well, they're overlapping in some ways, but a fairly distinct set of anxieties and fears. In the English sources, which are invariably written by clerics, the main anxiety is sin. It's the effects of sin. It's always a sinful person who returns from the dead. And the sinful person, depending on the degree of sinfulness, they can be destructive, they can be harmful, they can bring death and disease, or they may simply be seeking assistance to put their soul to rest. So they really betray anxieties about the effects of sin on the individual, but also how that sin can come back and impact an entire community, as well as, I think, anxieties about the afterlife, right? Anxieties about what exactly happens to the soul. And this is when, theories of purgatory are sort of being developed more thoroughly. So I think it really has to do with anxieties over perhaps not changes in theology, but sharper definition of certain aspects of theology, especially having to do with purgatory, but also just, this anxiety over sinfulness.
I think that you're right in that they always reflect what people are nervous about. And
Mhm.
one of the things that I think really demonstrates that is how you kill them. Because
Mm.
now, if somebody is an infected zombie today, you have to take out their head. You always have to take out their head. But in back in
Decapitation always works, yes.
destroy the brains. But back in the day, it was always a religious ritual, right? That would kill a zombie. So
So
or
that's one of the things that I find so fascinating in these English 12th century sources, especially, and it's similar in the Icelandic material. I can get into the differences and similarities if you like, but in the English sources, there's a debate going on, right? So it becomes very clear that traditionally what you do to stop a revenant is you decapitate it. Sometimes you need to burn the heart. Sometimes you need to burn the entire body, but there's some sort of physical destruction of the body that has to go on. But we
mm.
see these interesting experiments taking place with religious rituals, which sometimes work and sometimes go hilariously wrong. So, for instance, in the case of one revenant who was not a terribly sinful man, one of the ones in William of Newborough's History of English Affairs, the revenant is stopped simply by means of a written absolution from the bishop, which is he's disinterred, the written absolution is placed upon his chest, and he's reburied. And this stops his wandering. It eases his soul. In other cases, you do literally have to decapitate the body and burn the heart. One of my favorites is this is in Walter Mapp's Courtier's Trifles, De Nugis Curialum. There's one revenant, they try to erect a cross over the grave to keep him in it, but they do it while he's out wandering. And so when he comes back, he can't get back in the grave, so they have to remove it. And then there's attempts, to sprinkle holy oil that don't work on the body. So again, the degree of sinfulness sort of determines the methods that you have to use in order to stop the revenant from wandering.
That's funny. You have to up your game depending on how sinful they are.
Yes, yes. The idea of the the revenant trying to come back to his grave and not being able to get in because a cross has been erected.
Yeah, the
Um,
door's locked.
Yes, the door is locked. You can't come in. I've just always found that so entertaining.
It would be a good moment in something like Shaun of the Dead or
Oh,
something.
totally, totally, absolutely. One of my favorite movies, by the way. It's Son of the Dead answers every question you've ever had about, like, why don't zombies do this? Or how can, why can't you just escape them? Just pretend to be one of them or, run fast.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no problem, no problem. And you just have to act extra sinful, I guess, if it's the Middle Ages.
Yeah, it's very strange.
And these revenants are not the only monster that we can sort of recognize, even though they're a little bit different. There are also werewolves too, which I love to see appear in medieval sources. Can you tell us about some medieval werewolves?
Oh gosh, I love medieval werewolves. So medieval werewolves are, again, you can see their modern cousins in the Twilight series and in
Yeah,
all sorts
yeah.
of movies throughout the 20th century. And again, if you look at that, there's an evolution in werewolves. Often modern werewolves are, you're infected by a bite from a werewolf that causes you to turn. You become a werewolf during a full moon. You can only be killed by silver. Those are the standard 20th century tropes. More recently, lycanthropy is sort of depicted as more genetic, as running in families.
Yeah.
But if we look at the medieval sources, what's really interesting, oh, and I should mention too that, of course, werewolves they're always involving an anxiety over the loss of self-control and the loss of humanity,
Mhm.
right? Turning physically into a beast. And really, I mean, the medieval sources are concerned with that as well, but they're concerned with it in a very interesting way. So, medieval werewolves, for the most part, are what we call voluntary werewolves, meaning that they are able to change at will, usually by means of either an act or some sort of magical token. So, I'm thinking for Bisclavret, for example, one of the most famous medieval Old French werewolves. He goes into the woods and takes off his clothes
Mhm.
and turns into a werewolf. It's as simple
Mhm.
as that. And he does it whenever he feels like it. He does it every couple of weeks or so. For others, there might be a magic ring that they use, or there might be some other method of turning into a werewolf, but it's largely voluntary. There are a couple of exceptions to that, of course. And it's very clear that while these men, well, first of all, they're always noblemen. And while these men are in wolf form, they roam the woods killing animals and killing people. So they, do monstrous things. So they voluntarily go and do this, and then they return to civilization. They regain their human form and they return to civilization. What's interesting to me about these werewolf stories is that the werewolf in the stories, the medieval stories, is never really the monster. There's a formula to these stories, which basically goes a nobleman goes into the woods and becomes a wolf on occasion. This draws his wife's suspicion. The wife finally, after much wheedling and cajoling, manages to draw the secret out of her husband and then becomes horrified and decides that she needs to leave him. So she contrives some way to trap him in his wolf form and then takes off, leaving him stuck there, leaving him robbed of his humanity. The wolf then has to, trapped in this wolf form, unable to communicate, finds the king in some way, somehow or another, and through his actions proves his humanity, his rationality, his nobility, his loyalty. He acts in such a way that the king and the king's court are convinced that this animal is rational. Then the wife somehow shows up at court, the wolf attacks her, and the king thinks he's never behaved this way to anyone before. He's so well behaved, he's so courtly, he's so rational. There must be something up. The wife is then questioned, often tortured, finally admits to what she's done, and is enlisted to return her husband to his human form. And the wife is punished.
Mhm.
So they're pretty formulaic, although I will say they get more and more misogynistic as they go on.
Yeah. And I had always read these stories as being misogynistic in that the moral of the story is always you should just keep your husband's secrets because otherwise everything is going to go bad. It's going to go bad for you. And
Mhm.
in Beastcliff, I'm thinking as well, it's going to go bad for you for generations. All of her children after this have no noses, for
Right.
example.
Yeah. Yeah. The wolf in this Clover tears off her nose, and it ends up being an inherited trait that she passes down to her children. Right. So
Yeah.
she not only has she acted in a monstrous way, but she physically becomes monstrous and passes this on to her children as well. So, yeah, so it's always the wife who's the monster. But I think the other really interesting aspect, of course, is that the wolf, the nobleman himself, what's going on there is this anxiety about the fact that, especially during the 12th century and 13th century, when many of these stories are written, noblemen are expected to inhabit two very different worlds, right? To be very sort of courtly and have refined manners when at home or at the court, but then to go out and be killing machines, to be warriors, and to be able to like switch those on and off and to move between those two. And so it really betrays sort of an anxiety about women possibly losing love for their husbands because of the monstrous killing that they have to engage in, that they're required to engage in on a regular basis. Because warfare is, of course, part of their reason for being.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't until you remarked that they were all noblemen. I thought, yeah, this is more like a Beauty and the Beast story in that you have to allow him to go and be this monster, this wolf, this person who is causing destruction, and it's your job to leave him to that, or else you are failing as a wife. And I hadn't thought of it as
Yes.
being a commentary on the nobility and how they have to be predatory until you mentioned that they're nobles. And yeah, that's exactly where I went with that.
Absolutely. Yeah, they are invariably nobles. And so it's very much about anxiety over noble women possibly like not fulfilling their duties as wives, which is of course to support their husbands, to bear children, not to abandon them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it's a really sort of fascinating window into noble anxieties in the 12th and 13th centuries.
Yeah. I mean, it's always going to be the woman that's the monster in these stories. That's not too surprising, I think, to anybody.
Yes, yes. And again, sort of going back to my earlier comment about why I became a historian in the first place, one of the things, there were some obvious attitudes in the world around me that I thought needed some explaining. Misogyny was definitely one of them, anti-Semitism definitely another. I always tell my students too, granted, there are older roots of misogyny. They definitely go back a very, very long way, but I think the turning point for, Western Europe and for cultures like the US and Canada, who are direct descendants of Western Europeans, it's the 11th century clerical reform movements that
Mhm.
really sort of explain a lot of the degree and the virulence of the misogyny that we see.
Yeah, a lot of laying down rules about how this is supposed to be that don't necessarily reflect how it is, but this is how it's supposed to be. And all of these moral tales that involve monsters are supposed to be teaching us something. And usually that, that we need to sit down and be quiet.
Right. Right. Yes. Yeah. That is usually usually the moral of the tale for women, sadly.
Yes. Well, I think we would be remiss if, while we're talking about women, we didn't talk about dragons because there might be people who came to this episode just to hear about dragons. And interestingly, in the book, you say there aren't that many dragon stories when you think about it.
Yeah. I mean, I always found that a little bit odd considering how ubiquitous dragons are in sort of modern portrayals of the Middle Ages. Expect to see a lot more dragons. And you do see them in art and architect. I mean, you see them in the physical remains. But if you go around looking for stories about dragons, it turns out they can be rather difficult to find. Beowulf is a good example of one, of course. You know, a lot of saints fighting dragons, the occasional romance hero fighting dragons. There's some famous dragons in sort of Norse mythology and Icelandic sagas. Fafnir, of course, comes to mind. But I mean, I would expect medieval literature to be crawling with dragons, and
Yeah.
it's not.
Hmm. Do you think that's because perhaps they're too straight up as a metaphor for the devil, for demons? Do you think that that could be why, or that's why they're always fighting saints instead of heroes? I don't know.
Right, right. So that is the other thing about medieval dragons that I've always found a little not disappointing. I mean, I think, and I make a distinction in the book between sort of what I term pre-Christian dragons and Christian dragons. Dragons pretty much always represent evil in Western Europe. If you look at Beowulf or Fafnir, which I realize I am problematically characterizing as pre-Christian,
Yeah, yeah.
there will be scholars who will want to pick a bone with me, but these stories at least represent stories that were pre-Christian, that were written down by Christian authors later. At any rate, if you look at those dragons, they generally have to do with negative antisocial human traits. Often, the dragon in Beowulf, for example, sort of displays characteristics of bad lordship. If Beowulf is a good lord who is willing to sacrifice himself for his people, who is a ring giver, who bestows gifts on his men, then the dragon is his opposite. He hoards treasure. He doesn't distribute it in the way that it's meant to be circulated in order to create and strengthen social bonds. He's destructive. He kills people rather than preserving and protecting them. So the dragon in Beowulf is very much a foil for Beowulf as a king. Fafnir's similar. I mean, Fafnir is actually a fascinating example because he transforms into a dragon, right? He doesn't start off as a dragon. And it's because he has been evil and hoarding a treasure that he ends up turning into a monster. But again, these are sort of considered very antisocial, very negative traits in that pre-Christian world. The Christian dragons almost always embody Satan or a demon. They're sent to tempt saints, or they might even represent like the paganism of a local people that the saint has to overcome in converting them. And when the heroes, romance heroes, Christian romance heroes encounter dragons, again, it's symbols of evil or temptation. But what has always sort of struck me in reading about Christian dragons, anyway, is the ease with which they're defeated. They're
Yeah.
supposed to be the most fearsome opponent imaginable. And, you can practically make the sign of the cross and knock them down. I
Yeah.
mean, it's a little more difficult than that. But especially when we see like stories of saints interacting with dragons, fighting dragons, it often is just as simple as that. Just make the sign of the cross, then you're able to defeat the dragon and lead him away on a leash. What's that about?
It's just that easy. The sign of the
I
cross can defeat anything. Come on.
exactly. And of course, it's about the power of Christ to overcome evil, to overcome temptation. And I understand that, but it's always just struck me as, and I think in the Middle Ages, people also thought of dragons as an especially fearsome creature, as something that was especially terrifying. And yet, calling upon the power of Christ will enable you to overcome this great evil. But what it does do is make it rather disappointing for modern readers.
Yeah. Where you're like, where's the rest of the book?
Exactly. You're like, wait, that was it? The dragon in Fulk Fitzwarren, that one, at least there's some suspense there, right? I mean, he's going to eventually defeat the dragon, but at least the dragon gets a few good swipes in first. And Beowulf, yes, Beowulf manages to kill the dragon, but not before he's mortally wounded by it. Like there are real stakes
Mhm.
there. Beowulf is actually killed by the dragon as well. And you just don't see that in Christian stories about dragons. As much as I like dragons, I'm trying to think of any example of a Christian dragon that really manages to do some damage.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the things that I thought was interesting that you mentioned about dragons is the Fulk Fitzwarren story is one of the few that has an actual damsel in it.
Yes. Yeah, another trope that we sort of take for granted, right? Modern medievalism's always, knights are constantly running around rescuing damsels in distress. In this case, we have folk rescuing a damsel from a dragon, which
Yeah.
is one of the rare occasions in medieval literature where this actually happens. But clearly, it really sort of captured the imagination of people in the 19th and 20th century, and they just sort of remade the Middle Ages in this image.
That's right. They didn't like the ending of those stories, so they created new ones.
Right. Yeah. No, and what's really, I mean, I don't think I really talk about this too much in the book, but the Duke of Cartagena's daughter, who was the damsel captured by the dragon in the Fulk Fitzwarren story, she's kind of got an interesting thing going on as well. So the dragon has been ravaging the Duke's lands. He's abducted the Duke's daughter. But while he eats everybody else and all the livestock as well, he keeps her hostage. He sort of holds and she's his servant. Like it's her job to wipe the blood off of his beard after he's eaten. I also love that the dragon is bearded.
Yes.
He seems to have some human characteristics. But yeah, I haven't quite figured out what exactly to make of that yet. But
Maybe it's one of those things where you don't want to think too deeply about it.
probably not. Probably not. And of course, she's her primary role in this story is to be rescued by Fulk and to be offered in marriage to Fulk by her father. And Fulk only refuses because he's already married.
Oh, darn.
But I do think it's interesting, though, that she has like managed. I mean, she's clearly been with this dragon for quite a while and has managed to sort of survive. And that says something to me about her sort of mental toughness.
Yeah, yeah, I guess so. But of course, she probably doesn't even have a name, does she? I can't
That's a
remember.
no, I can't remember it either. I don't think she does. So often, I know that's one of the really aggravating things. So often women are unnamed. They're just so and so's daughter.
Someone needs to write that book. Someone needs to
I
give us
think, you know
that
what?
story.
I have always said that if history didn't work out for me, I would write historical romances.
There
Maybe
you
that'll be
go.
my first historical romance.
You will have to let us know because we will all have to pick it up and find out what happens to the damsel and the dragon. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking to us about monsters. It's just been a real pleasure to talk to you about it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really wonderful, and I'm always happy to talk about monsters.
To find out more about Charity's work, you can visit her faculty page at history.washington.edu/people/Charity-Urbanski. Her new book is Medieval Monstrosity, Imagining the Monstrous in Medieval Europe. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's up, Peter?
Hey. Well, I guess the Middle Ages are not known for its social mobility, right? Once a peasant, always a peasant. But the exception to that could be 8th century China. There's been some research where they looked at tomb epitaphs, like 3,600 tomb epitaphs. And what they discovered was that it was fairly easy for people from lower class statuses to move up into careers higher in the government because they had this education system and this imperial examination. And for one reason or another, officials didn't look at who your father was, or if you're an aristocrat. It was really kind of a fascinating piece. And it said this is kind of the equivalent to how it would have been in the United States in the 1950s and 60s in terms of social mobility, at least if you're a man.
Yes, let's be pretty clear on that. If you're a white dude, yeah.
Yes. Right. You're a white male. But it was, again, fascinating. Like, people that rose up through the ranks through their own abilities and educational backgrounds. So I thought that was very fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So we have that. Plus, we've got a few news stories. One that we didn't cover last year, so I'm just catching up, was the Agovian warrior stone that was found in Scotland, like in Glasgow. And this is, if you have a chance, take a look at it. It's very cool. Like probably around 10th century depiction of a warrior.
Ooh, nice.
Plus, we have Thomas Becket's relationship with King Henry, but this is Henry the Young King. Again, a little fraught with some problems, but not as bad as with his dad. And we also have a piece on 10 natural disasters in the Middle Ages, which I kind of picked at random, but one I really liked was how Geneva got hit with a tsunami.
You really liked that? That sounds like an interesting story. I mean, I would have picked that one too.
Indeed. They're all bad disasters, but
people do love their disasters. Well,
yeah.
Thank you, Peter, for rounding them up and putting them on the website. We'll have to get everyone to check them out. Thanks, Peter, for stopping by.
Thanks.
Thank you to everyone who supports my work and that of other indie historians through medievalist.net's Patreon page. Patrons have access to all sorts of awesome goodies like subscriptions to Medieval World magazine, a book club, digital downloads, and ad-free versions of medievalist.net and this podcast. If you're enjoying this podcast and you'd like to see it keep going, patronage is one of the best ways to make that happen. So please check out patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from dragons to flagons, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X at Medievalists. You can find me, Danielle Cebulski, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a terrific day.